we live in a much more mysterious and exciting world than modernity wants to suggest to us. We live in a world that is completely pregnant with the gods, with angels and saints who are operating everywhere and constantly intervening in our lives, and whom we can know and we can speak to and we can commune with, and that we need to develop certain practices so that we can draw close to them.
Sebastian is the senior editor of the European Conservative. He's an author, a religious thinker, a political thinker. If you search his name on YouTube, you'll see many speeches and lectures given at institutions you'd recognize on the matters of religion, the fall of the West, that sort of thing, and some very rewarding documentaries, which has been my favorite content that he is publishing on the European Conservative. He just basically returned from South Africa, where he has a 3-part documentary there, which is very good and very high production value that people should look at. Welcome, Sebastian.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor.
You've just been at the ARC conference, haven't you?
Well, I just went for one day. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to get your sort of, obviously you can talk about yourself, who you are and what your mission is. I want to know that. That would normally be my first question. But when I look at that ARC conference, I feels to me as if it's a placeholder, they're really liberals, right? They're liberals, not all of them, but it seems like when it should be an organized minority in touch deeply with God that can do such a thing, it's a sort of spirit of the times, trying to rally a spirit of the times solution. Maybe you could give some of your thoughts on that to start with.
Yeah, well, as you're well aware, Western conservatism for a couple of centuries now, and particularly in the Anglosphere, probably since Robert Peel's concession to the Whigs in the 19th century, has very much been a strange hybrid of conservative attachments and aesthetics with classical liberal abstractions. And we can't really seem to get out of this. And that was well represented at the conference. And one of the effects of this is a kind of rationalism that truncates all conversations about the political and social good to things of efficiency or the acquisition of material goods, the regulation of people's lives so that they can order their lives around the pursuit of private goods and not interfere too much with one another, and a constant suppressing of something like a conception of a shared culture and way of life by which people might flourish. Because if you do that, then particularly since the mid 20th century, there's been this fear that that's the highway to fascism. So a lot of these conferences, they exist largely to try to push out to the peripheries of the discussion anything like a transcendent good, a commitment to God, that we could build our lives around the transformation of human nature for the achievement of our finality, that we've actually got a transcendent purpose for existing here at all. And it's a really strange thing because, and I know you're very familiar with this term, and your listeners will be, it operates like an egregore. And I think it is an egregore because essentially, how shall I put this? Well, if you arrive at the ARC conference, it's very clear, and you work this out within about 10 minutes of talking to people, probably 95% of the people there are church-going Christians. But if you speak too much about the religious heritage of the West as politically and socially relevant, there's this sort of ripple of nervous laughter that goes around the room. Now,
Mm.
fortunately, I understand that by the second day, and I wasn't there for that, people were getting slightly more used to the idea that you can mention God, you can mention prayer, and so on. And I think, funnily enough, this is probably one of the good influences of America on the so-called vibe shift that's taking place in Britain and Europe at the moment. And I think we should expect to hear a lot more of that. You know, I've always thought that, for example, the term Judeo-Christian was a bit of a weasel word, and I'm very skeptical when it's deployed. But I'm also aware that it has certain political utility, because by saying we need to affirm our Judeo-Christian history, or we need to affirm Judeo-Christian values, for all of the weakness and emptiness of those kinds of terms, they do actually signal two things. They signal, one, that secularism is a problem, and two, that the Islamification of Europe is a problem. And you can signal those two concerns without having to say it. And I find it interesting that someone like Nigel Farage, for example, who has very much represented for a long time now a retrieval of a kind of 1980s secular conservatism in Britain, has nonetheless increasingly started using terms like that in order to suggest to his listeners that actually there's something deeper going on, and secularism and Islamification are very real threats to whatever might be something like a reconstruction of our way of life. So those are some of my sort of takeaway thoughts. It might be interesting to talk a little bit about the conversations that were orbiting issues of ecology and energy production at ARC, which I found more or less disturbing, but you might want to take it in a different direction.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to hear about that, but I'm probably more interested to hear about your deeper mission. And I suppose that does come down to when you do create this 1980s, if you try to go back to the 80s, go back to the 90s, you know, a lot of people, that's what they want to try to return to. But I don't think they realize even the 50s was we were in a terrible place. You just didn't know. We didn't know that modernity was already, this revolution is already so old. But I think you talk about it in your speech on National Conservative, I think it was, where you talk about the progressive having the deep need to actualize his individual self. And what struck me there, and this might speak to somewhat of your mission because it seems to be what you're doing, it's not just there are some truth to what they're talking about. It's just the problem is there's their own personal golden calf in the way in terms of that actualization. So they end up wanting to self-actualize a demon. It ends up being a demon because it's the empirical self, the empirical subject. Whereas what we're supposed to do is actualize the transcendent self, which is what we've lost, which would fill the void that people are desperately trying to grasp onto, something to defend them against the robust Islamism, which actually is empty at its ground, but it looks masculine and robust. But ultimately, it's empty. It's a pale in comparison to the rich life of essence when you actually do actualize the transcendent self, which has a plan for you, which is because it's the Lord in the final analysis, as you know. But is that not? I mean, you are articulating, it seems to be in your documentaries, you are articulating a cultural thing, but it is in our culture to disclose that. So it's not just about a what do you call it? A thesis that you emerge from in terms of society. That society actually used to cater for the disclosure of your personal destiny in terms of your relationship with the transcendent. But maybe you can speak a bit to your mission on how that void is filled.
Well, it might be
or what your
worth
mission
going.
is.
It might be worth going back to the doctoral research that I did under Roger Scruton years ago, which was then developed into a monograph for Routledge and is entitled Conservatism and Grace. And initially, the research plan was to look into how these two accounts of conservatism as one, a kind of secular way of trying to maintain a national way of life and manage an economy, and maintain a degree of political skepticism, started competing with another very different kind of conservatism, which was one that privileged above anything religion by establishment, and the idea that society had a religious form to it. And that was the initial plan. But in order to do that, I did a very deep research for over a couple of years into those great counter-revolutionary thinkers in the 18th century, namely Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre. And then I tried to trace how some of their thoughts had been received into modern conservative thinkers. And to my surprise, the research thesis ended up being very different, because what I identified, and I think I argue for this fairly convincingly in the book Conservatism and Grace, is that conservatism above anything is an attempt to salvage from revolutionary upheaval the human person, and that it maintains a human person, human being distinction, namely between what we are as moral agents to one another and what we are in terms of our species kind. And that really this distinction can only be posited of our species. So I started to go very deeply into this question, and then because I was working with Roger Scruton on this research, I realized that this had become his main preoccupation in the last decade of his life. And books like The Soul of the World and The Face of God and On Human Nature, this theme comes out over and over again. You find it in nascent sort of embryonic form in his book Sexual Desire, but it ends up taking a lead role in his philosophy in the last decade of his life. So what I think is going on in much of modernity is that whatever the self is principally a moral relation that exists between human beings. Whatever personhood is what we are to one another, and it's by being persons or personal that we are non-transferable. We cannot be. We're not interchangeable. We're completely unique and affirmed by the other. And I think that a society that privileges personhood in this way is downstream from a society that is essentially theocentric. It's a society, to use the term of Saint Francis of Assisi, it's a society that says, what I am before God, that I am, and nothing else. And it's this it's a society that has been formed by an entire mythos of God choosing us, choosing us as individuals, unique, willed into being by him, loved by him, and that he thinks of us when he dies for us, and that you kind of see, and Edmund Burke traces this in his book The Abridgment of English History. You see how the transformation of the European warlords, like the great Saxon warlords and the Roman centurions and so on, the transformation of them into the knights with their chivalric ideals of the Middle Ages is actually a transformation of people becoming more personal. This personhood is unfolding because now they're not plundering, they're not looking for goods, they're not trying to trample the weak for their own benefit. They are trying to serve the poor and protect the poor. And by the time you get to the Crusaders, you've got people who literally choose to leave their lands and abandon everything they know and love to go and bake in the sun covered in armor, in order to protect pilgrims who want to visit the holy places. And they'll just do that day in, day out for years until somebody stabs them to death, right? It's a complete self-emptying. And what I think happened in modernity is that the notion of the primacy of the person became unanchored from its religious context and religious foundation that gave it form, and it got turned on its head. So rather than the self or the person unfolding out of moral relations with others, with one's community, and ultimately with God, what happened was that the self was conceived as being prior to moral relations, prior to community. And of course, this eventually gives rise to contractarian theory, where you have people like Hobbes and Locke who think that prior to the formation of society, there's the atomic individual, there's the self who has to give up certain aspects of his selfhood in order to enjoy the safety that comes with being part of society and the benefits that come from being part of society. And so what you end up with is this myth of the pre-social self. And actually what society then becomes is not a web of moral relations within which the self emerges and the unique individual emerges and the person emerges, but rather society is, whilst it comes with many benefits and you're not going to starve and you'll be protected by a police force and all sorts of things, the fact is it always is going to be a threat to your authentic selfhood. And so then you end up with this really strange situation where, in a sort of odd schizophrenic way, you have to oscillate all the time between constantly wanting to protect society and submit yourself entirely to society, because which ultimately then ends up just being your contract with a more and more comprehensive, authoritarian, totalitarian, centralized power holding state. And you're constantly wanting to submit to that because you're aware of all the benefits that come from that relation, but at the same time you're always trying to emancipate yourself from it as well, so that you can be your true authentic self. And this entire mythology of modernity has basically created the modern Westerner. So if you wonder, when you see somebody who is walking down the street with their big stretched ears and their metal coming out of their nose and their big blue hair and their ripped up clothes, but they've also got their COVID mask on and their big badge saying I've been inoculated or whatever it is. Why have you got this person who is both trying to fully realize their pre-social self through a kind of theatrical repudiation of social norms, a kind of theatrical transgression, and simultaneously trying to demonstrate constantly their absolute subordination to the state and its regime? Well, it's because that is what modernity is, and modernity's created that kind of person. And I detest that kind of person. So my entire mission, as you put it, is to try and reveal to the modern world the fiction of the modern self, in the hope that we might start to retrieve something like a tradition-based society, slowly and incrementally, where actually genuine persons with their their kind of stable and noble moral relations with others, and ultimately their gift of self to God, which creates a very different kind of human, can start to return to the Western norm. So that's in a nutshell what I've been trying to do for the last few years.
Yeah, it's a very it's a difficult problem, although we're not able to just fashion a state. So it's not so much a pragmatic problem at the moment, but it could be. It could be. And what it makes me think of when you talk about that is thesis, antithesis, society, individual, you know, yin or yang. But what the true answer really is neither or both. Because when you are, that's the whole point, like you just mentioned at the end there, is that the self sacrifice to God is a sacrifice to he who is the future, which means that his mission that you participate in is saving, which means it is going to involve a negotiation because he is the future. He knows how to weave you in to that society by following divine will. So this polarization, this political problem of those two issues is fixed by deep moving towards union with him. Because if that can be disclosed, you can follow a vocational destiny. If intuition can be disclosed, and it actually deals with that problem. It's like the problem is we're on one domain of analysis. You can actually go, that's what the transcendent opens up. And the combat between those two poles is actually neutralized in a way. But you can also see the problem in how the East is, which has actually also infected and accelerated the Western problem you're talking about, which is with that Luciferic, nirvanic checking out that's just for you. It's not for society. It's not a saving mission. And so you can see how that's just with the women in their yoga pants. It's just boom, it's accelerated that new ageism. And Rudolf Steiner even talked about this, is that there's a deep karmic, or you could call the Western word for that really is destiny, a deep karmic issue since we materially defeated India, where their spiritualism, there's a superiority there, but they're not pushing the true truth. They're pushing a kind of ethnic, personal truth based on their former development in the spiritual domain. And the way I see it, it is taking us away from that. What would you call it? Synthesis. Like I said, the synthesis, the true synthesis that people should walk towards. And they end up walking to, well, they go towards a fake synthesis, which is just for the individuals. So it's not only is it this seeking of a false authentic self, which you actually is a provoking of the everydayness of society, which is the surface level. And so it fills you full of memes, which you think is your authentic self, like furry ears and various other mimetic phenomena. And that's identified with this. It fills the void, but it is a void. You're stuck in this existential dread, but it feels like something. So, yeah, what do you think of that?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Steiner, because I think he's quite helpful on this issue, particularly in how he understands the agency of the diabolical. So for Rudolf Steiner, as no doubt you know, he thought that the Western account of the diabolical as a purely spiritual agent who has deleterious effects on our spiritual life was really a very insufficient account of the diabolical, and it only told half the story, because he thought that the diabolical had two aspects to it, which he called the Luciferian and the Ahrimanic. And the Luciferian is the Western account that or the Christian account, which is that the devil is a fallen angel and he is purely spiritual and his effects are spiritual. But the Manichaeans and the Persians, they believed in Ahriman, the evil god of matter, who creates matter and who is himself matter. And what Rudolf Steiner thought was that actually, given that the spiritual and the material are correlated principles of a single reality called the world, in Aristotelian terms, matter and form, essence and body, whatever you want to say, that actually the nature of the diabolical, if we're to take the word seriously as the dividing principle, takes these two correlated principles and it sunders them from one another, so that we then find ourselves constantly fluctuating between a false spirituality that it has been torn from our embodied incarnate existence, and a kind of hedonism and materialism which forever cuts the spiritual life off from our purview. And then we just fluctuate between these two all the time. And actually you see this in modernity, the way that, you know, the fiction of the authentic self, the inner spirit, my true self that isn't disclosed to others, that only I can know, I have to be true to myself, all of this kind of stuff, this notion of this intangible, invisible inner self that is only known to oneself in the inner cloister of one's selfhood, that this has nothing to do with our embodied existence, the way we treat others, our moral relations, how we actually behave, what we do with our time, the books we read, you know, none of this, the music we listen to, whatever, is completely separate from all of that. And then, of course, you have spiritualities that lend themselves to that thinking enormously, where spirituality is very much a journey of emancipation from the body, and certain anthropologically dualistic spiritualities support this Luciferian way of conceiving spirituality. But then we also simultaneously have a culture of constantly seeking to satiate the appetites and the senses, constantly titillate, that we want to have 1,000 different variants of every given favorite food and favorite drink, and everything always available to us, and everything that we want immediately to be delivered to our home. And this constant need to enmesh ourselves as deeply as we can in the appetites and the senses and everything that the material world can offer us. And then we fluctuate between these two constantly. And basically, because two things that are correlated and belong together have been sundered and split and divided, they've been diabolicalized. And I think Rudolf Steiner is very helpful on this, in showing that actually, if you want a really comprehensive account of how the diabolical operates in our lives, you have to take both the Luciferian and the Ahrimanic aspects seriously.
Well, yeah, one is the subjective seduction, the other is objective hypnosis. So you can see how Ahriman is quite connected with Heidegger's technical and framing, the outer technical system, the proddings of modernity, the hedonistic lusts, and then the internal, of course, you've got the seduction of the ego, the seduction of, which is, you know, it can be endlessly complex in its, it can be diabolical, as you said, in its, and subtle, so subtle in its provokings to split yourself apart, because it's you that does it. And that also speaks to a lack of complete responsibility for what you become in modernity as well, is that everyone else is always to blame. And as you just said as well, that, what was it again? Yes, they talk about they're the only ones that know the true self, their own true, that they're not male, you know, all those various things. They're the only ones that know that. But the truth of the matter is, you're the last one that can be trusted in your judgment. Your judgments in modernity are completely corrupted since your birth. You haven't purified yourself. You don't have conscience. We lost conscience a long time ago. Our access to conscience, unless you're deeply religious and have a connection to the transcendent. You think you have those kind of things, conscience and judgment from a perspective of truth. But that stuff, the true self, is something that takes years to earn. You don't know. You're not to be trusted. And the problem is people are brought up in a thinking where they think, or they're pandered to think that they're the only one that they can trust. And they're actually, that's where the devil is, right next to you. You haven't been taught that Ahriman, or that Satan and Lucifer are actually on each shoulder right there. And you have to be wary of them. And that's where real sun are actually, sorry, jump in.
No, I was going to say, I think you're right about in emphasizing a deep religiosity for the kind of self-knowledge that I think you and I would support and encourage. But I'm also a great believer in, what I've referred to before as the wisdom of the pub, by which I mean that we're accountable to each other. That I'm a great believer in tight family networks, in having very close friendships, in immersing yourself in the local community, largely because there is nothing more unbearable than the person who hasn't routinely had to give an account of himself to those around him. And simply thinking that one can discover oneself by one's relationship with God, it's very easy for us to deceive ourselves and create our own gods that are approving of who we are and our behavior. And so I think I'm as you said earlier, I think the person emerges in a cruciform way. The person emerges in this horizontal way of being inducted deep into a community with its traditions and its culture and its society and its history, and all of the negotiations and the discussions that have to take place tacitly to make life possible and for us to bear with each other. And it's also vertical. It's constantly being aware and habituating in ourselves a sense of our ultimate destiny, of our purpose, why we're here, and the God with whom we're always trying to be docile, so that He might bring us into union with Himself. And it's out of this cruciform complexus, right in the center is the person, and the person unfolds out of that. If that makes sense.
No, it does completely. I think that what religious initiation can deeply help with here is that we have deep prejudices that emerge. Say you might have a prejudice to that some part of your community. But what Jesus does is dissolve those prejudices in the initiatory process. And a characteristic of conscience, when you are moving towards this transcendent self, which is deeply earned and a very tough, brutal self understanding of what you are in the low self, the likeness, from the perspective of being communing with conscience, which is above that, it threads you back into that community. It threads you back into that. So for a lot of people, because of the internet or modernity, it doesn't matter how much you tell them that this is good for you. They'll still have this deep resistance because of modernity, the internet, and everything like that, to threading back in. Some will be able to do it, but then it's like, I guess it's like, no, that's probably not a good analogy. Sending a wolf into a hen house. No, it's like, it's like you can't get rid of this new code unless you dissolve it. You can't get rid of this prejudice unless you forgive everyone and go through this process. Then you can truly actually be threaded back into that weave. Because we're never really going to have a situation where we can top down, or maybe we might get the opportunity to top down force a situation where we can rethread that community. But yeah, that would just be my instinctual response to what you're saying, is agreement, but there is a weaving of, this is what I guess that's what I was sort of saying, where there is some semblance of truth and the deep falsity of that progressive idea of the authentic self. and that's it. Because everyone has a destiny, but that destiny is in the community. That future destiny is, it's nothing, it looks nothing like what you think it looks like, though. That's how glorious the plan is for you. And it's going to be a plan of service. So you'll never disclose it for yourself unless you dedicate yourself to service, unless you get outside of that egoistic thinking. That's the only way. So, yeah, that's just
Well,
what
it's
came to me.
as you
So
say.
I don't think we're disagreeing.
No. I mean, absolutely, a path of initiation, as you put it, is a path of self-negation and self-death. That is what it is to go deep into the cave, as the ancient theurgists of the Mediterranean did. And you know, when the Christian tradition conceives of heaven as a communion of saints and angels who exist together before God. And the thing about the sanctified state is that they are completely overflowing into one another. That is what a communion of charity is. So heaven is the state of complete self-forgetfulness, as it were. This is a beautiful thing, and in the kind of communities we want to try and create on Earth, and what I think medieval society in Europe was trying to establish in many ways is a reflection of the communion of saints on Earth. Yes. Anyway.
No, that's very good. There's a book that I've just ordered. I think it's Smolyakov that talks about from the Orthodox Christian perspective on that ideal state of the future. That's actually someone that Steiner spoke very highly of. I look forward to reading that. And it's something that we should aspire to, because I think with the American situation, and maybe you can comment on this, the golden age is that, say you do take power, my view is that they don't really know where to go. Yes, that all they have is really the economy and memes. They don't actually, or sci-fi, which I would call a juvenile sci-fi vision of the future. But it could be something, if they disclosed providence, it could be something truly great. And I think when they shot at Trump, that really was not that's not God saying you're the chosen one. It's an opportunity. It's saying, here is your mission if you actually accept it.
I think a lot of these people, not just someone like J.D. Vance, but a lot of advisors in the Trump administration really have been formed in the crucible of post-liberal thinking from Deneen and Vermeule and Papin and all of these kinds of guys. And that may be that there may be all sorts of shortcomings that come with that. But what it isn't is a continuation of whatever has been the dominant ideology in the West until now. So, I mean, I welcome it. The question is, the question is, I suppose, one of the agency of the Holy Ghost more than anything. It's not obvious that Constantine, for example, and his Edict of Milan was that he was the obvious candidate in Western civilization to start to bring about a Christian social order, because he was a great warlord, and he was responsible for the deaths of thousands and thousands of people, and he deployed scorched earth policies, and was not very good at distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants during his campaigns, and he boiled his wife alive. There are aspects of his biography that do not make him an obvious candidate for the reign of agape on earth, right? But nonetheless, I think most people acknowledge that in the history of Christianity, the Holy Ghost was able to do something remarkable with that. And the institution of the Edict of Milan brought the churches out of the catacombs and out into the public arena, and it paved the way for Emperor Theodosius to declare Christianity as the official religion of the empire, which eventually gave rise to a Europe that was covered in monasteries and cathedrals and hospitals, and all the things that we think are sort of at the very heart of our civilization. So the question that haunts me now is Donald Trump, our Constantine? Because he need not be an obvious candidate to play that role. But I do think that we are going through a period of huge spiritual appetite, that people at the end of this, as we said, this kind of strange Luciferian Aramanic oscillation of Western society, are basically jaded and exhausted and demoralized, and that they are deeply traumatized after the process of deracination that modernity has entailed. They want their roots back. They want to reinduct themselves into their own Christian inheritance and heritage. Not everyone may put it like that or even know that that's what they're longing for, but I find it amazing, this kind of resurgence of the traditional mass, for example, attracting vast numbers of young people across the Anglosphere. And you can see that all the cardinals and bishops and priests that are still under the egregores of the 20th century are in a complete panic about this. But it's not. They're not going to stop, because that is quite obviously an operation of the Holy Ghost, who is fomenting and fostering this religious appetite and guiding it towards the truth and towards sanctification. And it's interesting that is a phenomenon that is in large part unique to the Anglosphere. You're not seeing that in old continental Europe. You're not seeing that much in South America, certainly not in the Philippines. But you are seeing it in Australia, in Canada, in America, and in England. So this is an astonishing thing. And then suddenly this man at the heart of the Anglosphere, who is totally on the peripheries of the political world, who's been a business owner and so on, and appeared in 1990s comedy films like Home Alone and so on, suddenly it comes out of nowhere in many ways, and is able to totally transform the political landscape. Now, I'm not saying that he has a Christian mission, but he's certainly made the Christian mission easier. Let's put it like that. Even something.
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah, I mean, even something like the attack on DEI and all of that kind of stuff. It's just it's analogous to the Edict of Milan.
Yeah, I think I think that is a nice idea. I think that it's a possibility that I thought about as well. When the pre-assassination, I thought he began the jester, perhaps he could be the hero. But then I thought I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I do look at them and I still see an expression of that sort of 80s culture that Trump flourished in. But I just mean in terms of their blood. It's still he is an expression of another kind of egregore, which is a we want. It's a different kind of we want.
Yeah.
It's not a religious hierarchical principle. It's not there's no providential edict from somewhere that you can sense that there's something deeply religious there. I think prayer saved him. I don't think that was a hyperstitional scenario, because it could be. Hyperstition is a temporal phenomena that Nick Land talks about, the philosopher, where belief affects reality. That's not providence, though. It's just it's magic. It's a low magic. But I think that was genuine, that prayer saved his life there. But whether the Lord wants, whether that's due to prayers and it's helping, or whether he has I don't think it's a direct mission. He could stand up and become a mission. But when I look at them, I don't see in Trump an authentic Christian, a deep Christian. Really, I see it as which is okay. I mean, you can get there. I don't think he will, but I think there's a deep possibility that he can open up something for something to take its place, or he can at least make conditions better for Christians, so this true Holy Spirit, or the Holy Spirit somehow can work with him, like you were saying. But at least it can open up a brief period of time, because we might just have a small period of time here. It does look good for now, but how long is that going to last? I'm not so sure. We should take advantage of that to build an authentic arc, an organized minority of people who deeply put the time in to connect with these principles that are genuinely, authentically led by providence in a way that we can trust, in people with authority where we can just sense it in the way that they're talking. We know that they have authority in the way that they're talking. It's something that disclosure is a mystery. When the apostles, when they talked to people, they had this substance. They had this, and that's what we really need again. We don't want it to be just a surface, because Saint Sarov talked about that the people would fill the Orthodox cathedrals and only 1% would be authentic Christians. Saint Sarov, the Russian saint. And he said this in the 1800s, that they would swamp back in and only a tiny, and he was very providential. He's a lot of his visions have come true. And so that's something a few Orthodox monks have been talking about as well. That doesn't mean it's not a good thing to have people here, but we should be concerned with people dwelling and deeply initiating, like we've already been talking about. So, because without that head, we're just going to end up where we were before. We can't. There's a great almost responsibility in the reaction, the reaction that's occurred, this awakening. We don't want to get pulled back underneath, so we're reprogrammed with something else. There's an opportunity here.
Sure.
To wake people up truly. And so that's my concern with what goes on.
I'm a great admirer of. You're talking about Saint Seraphim of Sarov, I think. Yeah. I'm a great admirer of him for obvious reasons, but I am slightly skeptical of views that make too great a distinction between the authentic Christian and the inauthentic Christian, largely because I think that like you, I don't think of Christianity principally as propositional. I think of it as initiatory. I don't think of it as just assent to doctrinal abstractions, but induction into the life of the holiness of Jesus Christ. So Christianity is principally sacramental and liturgical rather than propositional, to my mind. And I think you and I very much share that view. And but the upshot of that, of course, is that all of us are somewhere between Judas and Saint John the Divine, right? There's that there is a gradual sacramental transformation of nature by supernature going on in our lives all the time as we are initiated into the sacred mysteries. Now, at what point between Judas and John the Divine one becomes an authentic Christian is not obvious to me. So I'm always slightly, it's very popular at the moment to wage war on so-called cultural Christians. I wish we had a lot more cultural Christianity going on. I wish that we had people who were sort of building shrines to Our Lady on the corners of the roads, and keeping the feast days, not even really knowing why they're doing them, and so on. Because I don't think everything happens at the rational level. A lot of this sort of transformation happens through habit. It happens through the affects of the will, through cultural attachments, and so on. And of course, that's what our Lord says in Matthew 28, doesn't he? That the mission, the Great Commission, as it's known, is to make disciples of nations, that the national lives of these corporate persons, these peoples, the ethnoi, must become disciples rather than just the atomic individual. So my hope is, and maybe it's a doomed hope, but my hope is that whatever is happening, because the political landscape is certainly being radically changed and very, very quickly, will allow for a slow rerouting of these corporate persons called the nations of the West back into their own supernatural inheritance. And that might be a rocky path, because it certainly was in the past.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing. It's something that I've studied for a long time in terms of looking for the roots of nations. But yeah, it does. I mean, that comes to a providence question, is that if you really want to discover a future of a nation, it's less to do with what's conscious and more what's unconscious. It's more disclosing, again, the folk angel, as Steiner would talk about. And to do that, you have to initiate, to actually be able to communicate with things that are in the unconscious, that are, and when I say unconscious, I don't mean, you know what I mean. I don't mean personal unconscious. I mean objective unconscious. I mean outside, eternal. And so that's another very hard thing, is confirming it. But what concerns me about authentic Christianity is, what concerns me is that that's what the egregor's been so good at all these years. It's been so excellent at disguising itself and wearing our tradition as a flesh puppet.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's just something we need to think a little bit more about how to see it in people, how to go to the depths, how to look at someone and determine whether that's something that providence can work with or is working with. You know, it's not something we think about because we don't think about these faculties that are beyond what the empirical self just has and is born with. But if we did, maybe we'd think about other ways of, maybe we'd have more information about what is to be. And that's where I do think it's very useful. And again, these are issues that the political scene look at, even though a lot of them are very religious, but they don't take it seriously enough, is that looking at the saints and looking at their revelation for the future and stuff like that. I think that's something that political thinkers need to think more about, disclosing these faculties as well. That's tough. It's a very tough thing because it's something that is, it's not what's going to get you a fellowship at Princeton, you know, which is something that happened to you when you were talking about the more esoteric elements, right? That was that in your recent book. Maybe you can also talk, as we come to a close here, about how you discovered your vocation. Just for the young men that are watching, I think there's a lot of young men that watch this channel, and what helped you disclose what you were meant to do on that in terms of providence and on that subject. Maybe just maybe it's a bit deep for a final question because it might go on too long, but just see how you go with it.
Well, look, I don't really know if in terms of vocation, life is something that has basically just happened to me. Every time I've set out with a plan, it's never come to fruition. But things just keep happening to me, and I've learned over the years as I've got older just to go with it, really. And I never had any great plan to become a philosopher and write many books and get a doctorate and get these fellowships, but I just started writing down thoughts when they struck me. And I was doing my degrees part-time while I was working. I never went to university. I did all my degrees in the evening while I was working various jobs. And I've just tried to sort of live a full life, I suppose, and opportunities have opened them up. And I think this is largely why I've come to the conclusion that we live in a much more mysterious and exciting world than modernity wants to to suggest to us. We live in a world that is completely pregnant with the gods, you know, with angels and saints who are operating everywhere and constantly intervening in our lives, and whom we can know and we can speak to and we can commune with, and that we need to develop certain practices so that we can draw close to them. You know, I'm a great admirer of Agrippa and Abbot Trithemius and Valentine Tomberg in the modern age. You know, people who I think offer you habits of mind, habits of will, habits of imagination, and certain practices that if you take them seriously, give you a certain interior docility, so that you can allow life to happen to you, because you really you become sensitive to the many agents that are operating in this incredible universe, which is actually just the universe is just one massive cathedral. That's all it is. It just exists here to worship God, to give glory to him, so that we can enter its nave and sing his praises. And it's filled with fellow believers and with angels and saints, as I say, and they're all our friends, and they're all doing things. And yes, the gargoyles and the grotesques are on the outside, and there are plenty of malignant forces that try to frustrate and trouble our lives. But it's a great consolation to us that you know, the God of gods and his gods, as the psalm puts it, are with us. And so I suppose, you know, as I look back on my life, I realize that whatever I am now, and I'm not really sure what that is, but whatever I am now is just a kind of product of a sequence of events that happened to me. And the best thing that I can really do is just try to develop that interior spirit of docility. I'm not saying I'm very good at it, but I've come to the conclusion that's pretty much the best thing I can do in terms of developing a personal spirituality.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And I won't respond. I'll leave it there, and I'll leave it to part 2 at some future time. But it's a great way of ending it, and we can perhaps go into those subjects next time. But
Sure.
Great to talk to you, Sebastian. I think that tone and that spirit, and also it's kind of, you know, it's something people need to be more brave about now in this time. It is still it's a technical time of darkness where the technical things are overwhelming. They need to be braver about speaking about what is the truth of these spiritual matters, and that these beings are real, and that it's very reasonable to talk about them. You know, you have philosophers talking about hyper agents, they're catching up to what tradition has always known. So
exactly.
Thanks for joining, and we'll speak to you next time.
Thanks so much.